Wilhelm heard a noise behind him, and saw a child's face peeping through the tapestry at the end of the room. It was Felix. His father rushed towards him, took him in his arms, and pressed him to his heart. "Yes, I feel it," cried he. "Thou art mine. For what a gift of heaven have I to thank my friends. How comest thou, my child, at this important moment?" "Ask not," said the abbé. "Hail, young man! Thy apprenticeship is done, nature has pronounced thee free." After sorrow, often and in vain repeated, for the loss of Marianna, Wilhelm felt that he must find a mother for the boy, and also, that he could not find one equal to Teresa. With this gifted lady he was now thoroughly acquainted. Such a spouse and helpmate seemed the only one to trust to in such circumstances. Her affection for Lothario did not make him hesitate. She looked on herself as free. She had even spoken of marrying, with indifference, indeed, but as a matter understood. Before Teresa's answer came to hand, Lothario sent for our friend. "My sister Natalia bids me beg of you to go to her as soon as possible. Poor Mignon seems to be getting steadily worse, and it is thought that your presence might allay the malady." Wilhelm agreed, and proceeded on the journey. For hard against reason behind a light screen, which threw a shadow on her, sat a young lady, reading. She rose and came to him. It was the Amazon. Unable to restrain himself, he fell on his knee and cried, "It is she." He seized her hand, and kissed it with unbounded rapture. A day or two later, the following letter from Teresa was handed to Wilhelm. "I am yours, as I am, and as you know me. I call you mine, as you are, and as I know you. As it is no passion, but trust and inclination for each other, that leads us together, we run less risk than thousands of others. You will forgive me, will you not, if I still think often and kindly of my former friend? In return, I will press Felix to my heart, as if I were his mother. Adieu, dear friend. Teresa clasps you to her breast with hope and joy." Natalia wrote a letter to her brother. She invited Wilhelm to add a word or two. They were just about to seal it, when Jarno unexpectedly came in. "I am come," he said, "to give you very curious and pleasing tidings about Teresa. Now guess." "We are more skillful than you think," said Natalia, smiling. Before you asked, we had the answer down in black and white, handing him as she spoke the letter she had just written. Jarno read the sheet hastily. "What shall I say?" cried he. Surprise against surprise. "I came to tell you that Teresa is not the daughter of her reputed mother. There is no obstacle to her marriage with Lothario. I came to ask you to prepare her for it." "And what said Lothario?" taking Wilhelm by the hand. "What if your alliance with my sister were the secret article on which depended my alliance with Teresa? These amends the noble maiden has appointed for you. She has vowed that we two pairs should appear together at the altar. His reason has made choice of me," she said. "His heart demands Natalia, my reason shall assist his heart." Lothario embraced his friend, and led him to Natalia, who, with Teresa, came to meet them. To my mind, thou resemblest Saul, the son of Kish, who went out to seek his father's asses, and found a kingdom. I know not the worth of a kingdom, said Wilhelm, but I know that I have attained a happiness undeserved, which I would not change for anything in life. Oliver Goldsmith, the Vicar of Wakefield. Oliver Goldsmith, the most versatile and perhaps the most unstable of 18th-century men of letters, was born in Ireland on the 10th of November, 1728. At Trinity College, Dublin, he revealed three characteristics that clung to him throughout his career: high spirits, conversational brilliance, and inability to keep money in his pocket. After a spell of philosophic vagabondage on the continent, he settled in London in 1756, earned money in various ways, and spent it all. The Vicar of Wakefield, perhaps the greatest of all Goldsmith's works, was published on the 27th of March, 1766, after Dr. Johnson had raised £60 for him on the manuscript of it. The liveliness and grace of Goldsmith's style were never more plainly manifested than in this delightful story, and its faults, it contains many coincidences and improbabilities, are far more than atoned for by the masterly portrait of the simple, manly, generous, and wholly lovable vicar who is the central figure of the story. It has, says Mitford, the truth of Richardson, without his minuteness, and the humour of Fielding, without his grossness. If it yields to Lesage in the diversified variety of his views of life, it far excels him in the description of domestic virtues and the pleasing moral of the tale. Goldsmith died on the 4th of April, 1774. See also Volume 17. Family Portraits. I was ever of opinion that the honest man who married and brought up a large family did more service than he who continued single and only talked of population. From this motive, I chose my wife, as she did her wedding gown, not for a fine glossy surface, but such qualities as would wear well. There was nothing that could make us angry with the world or each other. We had no revolutions to fear, nor fatigues to undergo. All our adventures were by the fireside, and all our migrations from the blue bed to the brown. My children, as they were educated without softness, so they were at once well-formed and healthy. My 4 sons hardy and active, my 2 daughters beautiful and blooming. Olivia, the elder daughter, was open, sprightly, and commanding. Sophia's features were not so striking at first, but often did more certain execution, for they were soft, modest, and alluring. The profits of my living I made over to the orphans and widows of the clergy of our diocese, for, having a sufficient fortune of my own, I was careless of temporalities, and felt a secret pleasure in doing my duty without reward. My eldest son, George, just upon leaving college, fixed his affections upon Miss Arabella Wilmot, the daughter of a neighbouring clergyman, who was in circumstances to give her a large fortune. Mr. Wilmot was not averse to the match, but after the day for the nuptials had been fixed, I engaged in a dispute with him which threatened to interrupt our intended alliance. I have always maintained that it is unlawful for a priest of the Church of England, after the death of his first wife, to take a second, and I showed Mr. Wilmot a tract which I had written in defense of this principle. It was not till too late I discovered that he was violently attached to the contrary opinion, and with good reason, for he was at that time actually courting a fourth wife. While the controversy was hottest, a relation, with a face of concern, called me out. "The merchant in town," he said, "in whose hands your money was lodged has gone off, to avoid a statute of bankruptcy. Your fortune is now almost nothing." It would be useless to describe the sensations of my family when I divulged the news. Near a fortnight had passed before I attempted to restrain their affliction, for premature consolation is but the remembrance of sorrow. During this interval I determined to send my eldest son to London, and I accepted a small cure of £15 a year in a distant neighbourhood. The first day's journey brought us within 30 miles of our future retreat, and we put up at an obscure inn in a village by the way. At the inn was a gentleman who, the landlord told me, had been so liberal in his charity that he had no money left to pay his reckoning. I could not avoid expressing my concern at seeing a gentleman in such circumstances, and offered the stranger my purse. "I take it with all my heart, sir," replied he, "and am glad that my late oversight has shown me that there are still some men like you." The stranger's conversation was so pleasing and instructive that we were rejoiced to hear that he was going the same way as ourselves. The next morning we all set forward together. Mr. Burchell and I lightened the fatigues of the road with philosophical disputes, and he also informed me to whom the different seats belonged that lay in our view. "That, Dr. Primrose," he said to me, pointing to a very magnificent house, "belongs to Mr. Thornhill, a young gentleman who enjoys a large fortune, though entirely dependent upon the will of his uncle, Sir William Thornhill." "What," cried I, "is my young landlord, then, the nephew of one who is represented as a man of consummate benevolence?" At this point we were alarmed by the cries of my family, and I perceived my youngest daughter in the midst of a rapid stream, and struggling with the torrent. She must have certainly perished had not my companion instantly plunged into her relief. Her gratitude may be more readily imagined than described. She thanked her deliverer more with looks than words. Soon afterwards Mr. Burchell took leave of us, and we pursued our journey to the place of our retreat. To the squire at a small distance from our habitation was a seat overshadowed by a hedge of hawthorn and honeysuckle. Here, when the weather was fine, and our labour soon finished, we usually sat together to enjoy an extensive landscape in the calm of the evening. On an afternoon about the beginning of autumn, when I had drawn out my family to the seat, dogs and horsemen swept past us with great swiftness. After them a young gentleman, of a more genteel appearance than the rest, came forward, and, instead of pursuing the chase, stopped short, and approached us with a careless, superior air. He let us know that his name was Thornhill, and that he was the owner of the estate that lay around us. As his address, though confident, was easy, we soon became more familiar, and the whole family seemed earnest to please him. As soon as he was gone, my wife gave the opinion that it was a most fortunate hit, and hoped again to see the day in which we might hold up our heads with the best of them. "For my part," cried Olivia, "I don't like him, he is so extremely impudent and familiar." I interpreted this speech by contrary, and found that Olivia secretly admired him. "To confess the truth," said I, "he has not prepossessed me in his favor. I had heard that he was particularly remarkable for faithlessness to the fair sex." A few days afterwards we entertained our young landlord at dinner, and it may be easily supposed what provisions were exhausted to make an appearance. As he directed his looks and conversation to Olivia, it was no longer doubted but that she was the object that induced him to be our visitor, and my wife exulted in her daughter's victory as if it were her own. On one evening Mr. Thornhill came with two young ladies, richly dressed, whom he introduced as women of very great distinction and fashion from town. The two ladies threw my girls quite into the shade, for they would talk of nothing but high life and high-lived company. 'Tis true, they once or twice mortified us sensibly by slipping out an oath. Their finery, however, threw a veil over any grossness in their conversation. I now began to find that all my long and painful lectures upon temperance, simplicity, and contentment were entirely disregarded. The distinctions lately paid us by our betters awakened that pride which I had laid asleep, but not removed. When the two ladies of quality showed a willingness to take our girls to town with them as companions, my wife was overjoyed at our good fortune. But Mr. Burchell, who had at first been a welcome guest at our house, but had become less welcome since we had been favored with the company of persons of superior station, dissuaded her with great ardor, and so angered her that she ended by asking him to stay away. Returning home one day, I found my wife and girls all in tears, Mr. Thornhill having been there to inform them that their journey to town was entirely over. The two ladies, having heard reports of us from some malicious person, were that day set out for London. We were not long in finding who it was that had been so base as to asperse the character of a family so harmless as ours. One of our boys found a letter case which we knew to belong to Mr. Burchell. Within it was a sealed note, superscribed, the copy of a letter to be sent to the two ladies at Thornhill Castle. At the joint solicitation of the family, I opened it, and read as follows: "Ladies, I am informed that you have some intention of bringing two young ladies to town, whom I have some knowledge of, under the character of companions. As I would neither have simplicity imposed upon nor virtue contaminated, I must offer it as my opinion that the impropriety of such a step will be attended with dangerous consequences. Take therefore the admonition of a friend, and seriously reflect on the consequences of introducing infamy and vice into retreats where peace and innocence have hitherto resided." Our doubts were now at an end. It appeared to me one of the vilest instances of unprovoked ingratitude I had ever met with. As we sat ruminating upon schemes of vengeance, Mr. Burchell himself entered and sat down. "Do you know this, sir, this pocket-book?" said I. "Yes, sir," returned he, with a face of impenetrable assurance. And do you know this letter? Yes, it was I that wrote that letter. And how could you so basely presume to write this letter? And how came you, replied he, with looks of unparalleled effrontery, so basely to presume to open this letter? I could scarcely govern my passion. Ungrateful wretch! I cried. Begone, and no longer pollute my dwelling with thy baseness. So saying, I threw him his pocket-book, which he took up with a smile, and left us astonished at the serenity of his assurance. 3. The elopement. The visits of Mr. Thornhill now became more frequent and longer, but all the schemes of Olivia and her mother to bring him to a declaration came to nothing. And although Olivia considered his fine sentiments as instances of the most exalted passion, it seemed to me plain that they had more of love than matrimony in them. One evening, as I sat by the fireside, thanking heaven for tranquility, health, and competence, and thinking myself happier than the greatest monarch upon earth, I noticed that Olivia was absent. "Where is my darling Olivia?" I asked. Just as I spoke, my boy Dick came running in. "Oh, Papa, Papa, she is gone from us, she is gone from us forever." "Gone, child?" "Yes, she is gone off with 2 gentlemen in a post-chaise, and one of them kissed her. And she cried very much, but he persuaded her, and she went into the chaise." "Now, then," cried I, "may heaven's everlasting fury light upon him and his! Thus to rob me of my child! Bring me my pistols, I'll pursue the traitor. Old as I am, he shall find I can sting him yet, the perfidious villain." My poor wife caught me in her arms. "Indeed, sir," said my son Moses, "your rage is too violent." "I did not curse him, child, did I?" "Indeed, sir, you did." "Then may heaven forgive me and him. But it is not a small distress that can wring tears from these old eyes. My child, to undo my darling. May confusion seize, heaven forgive me. What am I about to say? Had she but died! My son, bring hither my Bible and my staff. I will pursue her, and though I cannot save her from shame, I may prevent the continuance of her iniquity. My suspicions fell entirely upon our young landlord, whose character for such intrigues was but too well known. I therefore directed my steps towards Thornhill Castle. He soon appeared, with the most open, familiar air, and seemed perfectly amazed at my daughter's elopement, protesting upon his honor that he was quite a stranger to it. A man, however, averred that my daughter and Mr. Burchell had been seen driving very fast towards the Wells, about 30 miles distant. I walked towards the Wells with earnestness, and on entering the town I was met by a person on horseback, whom I remembered to have seen at the Squire's, and he assured me that if I followed them to the races, which were but 30 miles further, I might depend upon overtaking them. Early the next day I walked forward to the races, but saw nothing of my daughter or of Mr. Burchell. The agitations of my mind, and the fatigues I had undergone, now threw me into a fever. I retired to a little ale-house by the roadside, and here I languished for nearly 3 weeks. The night coming on as I was 20 miles from home on my return journey, I put up at a little public house, and asked for the landlord's company over a pint of wine. I could hear the landlady upstairs bitterly reproaching a lodger who could not pay. "Out, I say," she cried, "pack out this moment." "Oh, dear madam," replied the stranger, "pity a poor, abandoned creature for one night, and death will soon do the rest." I instantly knew the voice of my poor ruined child, Olivia, and flew to her rescue. "Welcome, anyway, welcome, my dearest lost one, to your poor old father's bosom." "Oh, my own dear," for minutes she could say no more, "my own dearest, good papa. You can't forgive me, I know you cannot." "Yes, my child, from my heart I do forgive thee." After we had talked ourselves into some tranquility, I said, "It surprises me how a person of Mr. Burchell's seeming honor could be guilty of such deliberate baseness." "My dear papa," returned my daughter, "you labor under a strange mistake. It is Mr. Thornhill who has ruined me, who employed the two ladies, as he called them, but who, in fact, were abandoned women of the town, to decoy us up to London. Their artifices would certainly have succeeded but for Mr. Burchell's letter, who directed those reproaches at them which we all applied to ourselves." "You amaze me, my dear," cried I, "but tell me, what temptation was it that could thus obliterate your virtue?" "He offered me marriage," replied she. "We were indeed married secretly by a popish priest, whose name I was sworn to conceal." "What?" interrupted I, "and were you indeed married?" "Alas," she said, "he has been married already by the same priest to 6 or 8 wives more, whom, like me, he has deceived and abandoned." "Have patience, my child," cried I, "and I hope things will yet be better. Tomorrow I'll carry you home to your mother." Poor woman, this has gone to her heart, but she loves you still, Olivia, and will forget it. For fresh calamities, it was late the next night when I approached my own home. I had left Olivia at an inn 5 miles away, intending to prepare my family for her reception. To my amazement, I saw the house bursting out into a blaze of fire, and every aperture red with conflagration. I gave a loud convulsive outcry, which alarmed my son, and all my family ran out, wild with apprehension. Our neighbors came running to our assistance, but the flames had taken too strong a hold to be extinguished, and all the neighbors could do was to stand spectators of the calamity. They brought us clothes and furnished one of our outhouses with kitchen utensils, so that by daylight we had another, though a wretched, dwelling to retire to. In the midst of this affliction our poor lost one returned to us. "Ah, madam," cried her mother, "this is but a poor place to come to after so much finery. I can afford but little entertainment to persons who have kept company only with persons of distinction, but I hope heaven will forgive you." The unhappy victim stood pale and trembling, unable to weep or to reply. "I entreat, woman," I said to my wife, with severity in my voice and manner, "that my words may be now marked once for all. I have here brought you back a poor deluded wanderer. Her return to duty demands the revival of our tenderness. The real hardships of life are now coming fast upon us. Let us not increase them by dissensions among each other. The kindness of heaven is promised to the penitent, and let ours be directed by the example. My daughter's grief, however, seemed formed for continuing, and her wretchedness was increased by the news that Mr. Thornhill was going to be married to the rich Miss Wilmot, who had formerly been betrothed to my eldest son. On a morning of peculiar warmth for the season, when we were breakfasting out of doors, Mr. Thornhill drove up in his chariot, alighted, and inquired after my health with his usual air of familiarity. "Sir," replied I, "your present assurance only serves to aggravate your baseness." "My dear sir," returned he, "I cannot understand what this means." "Go," cried I, "thou art a poor, pitiful wretch, and every way a liar, but your meanness secures you from my anger." "I find," he said, "you are bent upon obliging me to talk in a harsher manner than I intended. My steward talks of driving for the rent, and it is certain he knows his duty. Yet, still, I could wish to serve you, and even to have you and your daughter present at my marriage." "Mr. Thornhill," replied I, "as to your marriage with any but my daughter, that I never will consent to. And though your friendship could raise me to a throne, or your resentment sink me to the grave, yet would I despise both." "Depend upon it," returned he, "you shall feel the effects of this insolence," and departed abruptly. On the very next morning his steward came to demand my annual rent, which, by reason of the accidents already related, I was unable to pay. On the following day 2 officers of justice took me to the county gaol. There is no situation, however wretched it seems, but has some sort of comfort attending it, and I found mine in the help and kindness of a fellow prisoner, Mr. Jenkinson by name, who was awaiting trial for several acts of cheating and roguery. I myself, indeed, had been one of his victims. The fortune of my family, who were lodged in the town, was wholly and distressingly adverse. Olivia was ill, and longed for me to make my submission to Mr. Thornhill by approving his marriage with Miss Wilmot. When I had been confined a fortnight, Mr. Jenkinson brought me dreadful news: Olivia was dead. And while yet my grief was fresh upon me, my wife came weeping to tell me that Sophia had been seized by ruffians and carried off. The sum of my miseries, thought I, is now made up, nor is it in the power of anything on earth to give me another pang. Yet another awaited me. My eldest son, George, to whom I had written, went to Thornhill Castle to punish our betrayer. He was attacked by the coward's servants, injured one of them, and was brought into the very prison where I was confined. The enemy of my family had now triumphed completely. My only hope was in a letter I had written to Sir William Thornhill, telling him of the misdeeds of his nephew. I was by this time myself extremely ill. I sought to break from my heart all ties that bound it to earth, and to fit myself for eternity. The rescue on parting from my unhappy son, who was removed to a stronger cell, I laid me down in bed, when Mr. Jenkinson, entering, informed me that there was news of my daughter. He had scarcely delivered his message when my dearest girl entered with Mr. Burchell. "Here, Papa," she cried, "here is the brave man to whom I owe my delivery." To this gentleman's intrepidity a kiss from Mr. Burchell interrupted what she was going to add. "Ah, Mr. Burchell," said I, "you were ever our friend. We have long discovered our errors with regard to you, and repented our ingratitude. And now, as you have delivered my girl, if you think her a recompense, she is yours." "But I suppose, sir," he replied, "you are apprised of my incapacity to support her as she deserves." "I know no man," I returned, "so worthy to deserve her as you." Without the least reply to my offer, he ordered from the next inn the best dinner that could be provided. While we were at dinner, the gaoler brought a message from Mr. Thornhill, desiring permission to appear before his uncle in order to vindicate his innocence and honor. The poor, harmless Mr. Burchell, then, was in reality the celebrated Sir William Thornhill. Mr. Thornhill entered with a smile, and was going to embrace his uncle. "No fawning, sir, at present," cried the baronet. "The only way to my heart is by the road of honor, but here I only see complicated instances of falsehood, cowardice, and oppression." At this moment Jenkinson and the gaoler's 2 servants entered, hauling in a tall man very genteelly dressed. As soon as Mr. Thornhill perceived the prisoner and Mr. Jenkinson, he seemed to shrink backward with terror, for this was the man whom he had put upon the carrying off of Sophia. "Heavens!" cried Sir William, "what a viper have I been fostering in my bosom! As Mr. Thornhill and I have been old fellow sporters," said Jenkinson, "I have a friendship for him, and I hope he will show a proper return of friendship to his own honest Jenkinson, who brings him a wife." So saying, he went off and left us. "I am surprised," said the baronet, "what he can intend by this." "When we reflect," I replied, "on the various schemes, amazement. Do I see my lost daughter? It is my Olivia." "As for you, squire," said Jenkinson, "this young lady is your lawful wedded wife. Here is the license to prove it." He commissioned me, "Gentlemen," he continued, "to procure him a false license and a false priest in order to deceive this young lady." What did I do, but went and got a true license and a true priest. To my shame, I confess it, my only design was to keep the license and let the squire know that I could prove it upon him whenever I wanted money. "How could you," I cried, "add to my miseries by the story of her death?" "That," replied Jenkinson, "is easily answered. I thought the only probable means of freeing you from prison was by submitting to the squire, and consenting to his marriage with the other young lady. But this you had vowed never to grant while your daughter was living, so I had to join with your wife in persuading you that she was dead." Mr. Thornhill's assurance had now entirely forsaken him. He fell on his knees before his uncle, and implored compassion. "Thy vices, crimes, and ingratitude," said the baronet, "deserve no compassion, but a bare competence shall be supplied thee, and thy wife shall possess a third part of that fortune which once was thine." Then, turning to Sophia, he caught her to his breast with ardor. "I have sought," he cried, "for a woman who, a stranger to my fortune, could think I had merit as a man. How great must be my rapture to have made a conquest over such sense and such heavenly beauty. On the next day Sophia was wedded to Sir William Thornhill, and my son George, now freed from justice, as the person supposed to be wounded by him was detected to be an impostor, led Miss Wilmot to the altar. As soon as I had awakened that morning, I had heard that my merchant had been arrested at Antwerp, and that my fortune had been restored to me. It may not be improper to observe, with respect to Mr. Thornhill, that he now resides as companion at a relation's house. My eldest daughter has told me that when he reforms she may be brought to relent. I had now nothing on this side of the grave to wish for. All my cares were over. It only remained that my gratitude in good fortune should exceed my submission in adversity. Edmund and Jules de Goncourt. René Maupin. Edmund de Goncourt, born at Nancy on the 26th of May, 1822, and his brother Jules, born in Paris on the 17th of December, 1830, were primarily artists, who, while wandering over France, knapsack on back, discovered that their notebooks also made them writers. In 1850 they entered upon a literary partnership which only finished with the death of the younger brother on the 20th of June, 1870. Their earliest literary endeavors consisted of a series of historical studies dealing with the France of the second half of the 18th century. It was not until 1860, with the publication of their first novel, Les Hommes de Lettres, that they discovered their true bent lay in fiction. René Maupin, which is, perhaps, the best known of their books, was published in 1864. As a psychological analysis of contemporaneous youth, it is probably without its equal in French fiction. The plot of the story, wrote Edmund de Goncourt, is secondary. The authors have rather preferred to paint the modern young woman as she is, the product of the artistic and masculine system of education in force during the last 30 years. We have also attempted to portray the modern young college man influenced by the Republican ideas of the time since Louis-Philippe. Edmund de Goncourt died on the 16th of July, 1896. A wayward girl, yes, I love riding and hunting. I never miss a meet. The wind blowing through one's hair, the hounds, the horns, the trees flying past you, it is intoxicating. In those moments I feel brave. Life has few other pleasures for a well-brought-up girl like me. Everything is shocking. I dance, yes, but do you think I am allowed to talk to my partner? Yes, no, yes, that's all. That's proper. And I am allowed to read if the books and articles are proper. I paint in oils, and that shocks my family. A young lady must not go beyond copying roses in watercolors. Isn't the current strong here? René Maupin and young Reverchon, her parents' guest, were swimming in the Seine. How beautiful, exclaimed the girl, as she noticed the evening sun gilding the river and the banks where country and suburb merged into each other. You are an artist by nature, mademoiselle. Ouf, she exclaimed with a comic intonation. A boat approached. Well, René, how is the water? asked one of the rowers. Splendid, thanks, Denoisel, she replied, as she mounted the steps lowered for her. I was almost getting nervous for you. And Reverchon. Ah, there he is. Renée was the youngest daughter of a distinguished Napoleonic officer, who, at the time of the Revolution of 1830, was elected deputy, and fought with all his ardor for the liberal cause, but who subsequently, at the urging of his wife, a tyrannical conventional member of the bourgeois, retired from the world of politics and established a sugar refinery, so as to be able to provide suitably for his 3 children. The first 2, a boy born in 1826 and a daughter in 1827, were a disappointment to the old soldier. They were too reasonable, too grown up before they were children, but in Renée, who was born after an interval of 8 years, M. Mauprin found ample consolation. His heart revelled in her pranks and merry laughter, and she grew up the pet of her father, whose affection she returned with all her heart. She was now 20, her brother Henry, serious, studious, plodding and determined to make a career, was a lawyer, and had made some reputation by his articles on statistical subjects, and Henriette, her elder sister, had found a husband in M. de Varendie, whose wealth and position allowed her to devote herself to the life of empty amusement, divided mainly between long rounds of calls, the opera, and the bois, which filled the days of the moneyed Paris bourgeoisie of that time. Madame Mauprin, delighted with Henriette's match, was anxious to find an equally suitable partner for Renée, but the high-spirited girl had a will of her own, and seemed to take almost a pleasure in crossing her mother's transparent matrimonial schemes. Quite a number of eligible young men had been introduced to the house at La Briche and had left it without having furthered their suit. Reverchon had now been invited with similar intentions, and Renée was no more amenable than before. While her mother filled the young man's ears with praise of her accomplishments, the wayward girl, with her charming ingenuous talk, did her best to demonstrate her lack of those negative conventional virtues that were expected from a well-educated French girl in those days. She made Madame Mauprin turn first crimson, then pale, when she finally proceeded to cut Denoisel's hair in the drawing-room after dinner. Denoisel was the son of Mauprin's bosom friend, who had fought by his side in many battles, and who on his deathbed had made him his son's guardian. Mauprin became more than a guardian to the boy, he became his father. When Henry and Henriette were born, it seemed to Denoisel that he had been given a brother and sister, but he adored the baby Renée, and he alone succeeded in making her listen and obey. Sometimes said Henry to Denoisel as they travelled back to Paris, "My sister's follies are harmless enough, but tonight, before that fellow, I am sure the marriage will fall through. And such an excellent match." "You think so?" I began to fear for her. And that's why I lent myself to her prank. He is too hopelessly commonplace, a tailor's dummy. He would never have understood her. Your sister ought to marry a man of intelligence and character. And Madame Mauprin, as she prepared for bed, lectured her husband upon acceding to all his favourite's whims. Another marriage missed. Henry spoke to me this evening. He is sure Virchon will not have her. Well, what of it? Why, he is the 10th. Renee will get an awful reputation. She will see when she is 30, and you too. Then, after a pause, and now about your son. He is 29 now. He, at any rate, has no objection to marriage. Have you ever thought of finding him a suitable wife? She continued to talk and to grumble until Mauprin fell asleep. Henry is reasonable enough, but he is a young man, and you know the danger. It's driving me mad. What do you think of trying Madame Rosier's? There was no reply. Madame Mauprin resigned herself to silence, and turned to find the sleep which only came with morning. 2 plots and plays next morning. Madame Mauprin proceeded to Paris, and drove to her son's apartments in the Rue Taitbout. She found him at work. After some beating about the bush she approached the object of her visit. I fear, she began, that you must have some reason for not marrying, isn't it? My dear mother, you need not worry. I know that wealth is needed for a successful career, and that the best and most honorable way to obtain it is a good marriage. And I am determined to make a career. I shall get married soon enough, and better, perhaps, than you think. At La Bridge, meanwhile, M. Mauprin vainly tried to be stern with his pet. I have done it purposely, she said. And why? Because I love you better than that young gentleman who was in no way sympathetic to me. You are ungrateful. But listen, my dear child. Fathers are egotists, and would prefer to keep their children. But I am old, and I should not like to part without seeing you married, a mother, with affections that will replace mine. Oh, this is wicked. Never, never, she exclaimed, let me cry alone for a minute. And she left the room hurriedly. When she returned after a while, she found Denoisel in the room. You have been out. And where have you been? Well, if you want to know, I have been to church to pray that I may die before father. I knelt before a statue of the Virgin. And, you may laugh, but it seemed to me that she nodded at my request. And it made me quite happy. The conversation drifted to gayer topics, and the two soon fell into their wonted tone of banter. Tell me, Renee, said Denoisel, have you never felt, I won't say love, but some sentiment for anybody? Never. That sort of thing only occurs when the heart is empty. But when it is defended by the affection one feels for a father as a child, I felt perhaps the beginning of that emotion of which one reads in novels. And do you know for whom? No. For you. Oh, only for a moment. I soon loved you differently for having corrected the spoiled child of its faults, for having directed my attention to noble and beautiful things. And I resolved to repay you by true friendship. M. Mauprin entered the room, and interrupted the confidences. A few days later, Renee, having set her mind upon playing in private theatricals, a discussion arose about the filling of the second lady's part in the play that had been chosen. One by one the names suggested were dismissed, until Henry said, "Why not ask Mademoiselle Bourget? They are just staying at Sanois." "No, Emmy," replied Renee. "I'd love it. But she was so cold towards me last winter. I don't know why." "She will have £12,000 a year," interrupted de Noisel, "and her mother knows that you have a brother. And they are not a little proud of their money." 12,000 a year. Madame Maupin thought of her son's future, and supported his suggestion. It was decided that they would call on the Bourgets on Saturday. To Sanois they went as arranged on the Saturday. They were received with effusion, and had to put up for an hour or so with the unbearable arrogance of their host's display of wealth. Renée's warm advances to the playmate of her childhood were received by Noémie with coolness, not to say reluctance, but the request that Noémie should take part in the theatricals met with her mother's approval, the shy girl's objections, nervousness, lack of talent, and so forth being overruled by Madame Bourget. Before the two families parted, it was arranged that Noémie should be taken by her governess to attend the rehearsals at the Maupins' house. Renée's whole-hearted friendliness and sparkling humour soon overcame Noémie's reserve, and under de Noisel's direction the amateur actors made rapid progress. Madame Bourget herself came to one of the rehearsals, and, after the first compliments, expressed her surprise that Henry, the principal actor, was absent. "Oh, he has a wonderful memory," said his proud mother. "2 rehearsals will set him right." At last the great day arrived. A stage had been arranged in the large drawing room, which was filled to its utmost capacity, the ladies being seated in the long rows of chairs, the men standing behind and overflowing through open doors into the adjoining rooms. The play chosen was The Caprice. Henry, who revealed rare talent, took the part of the husband, Noémie of the neglected wife. The curtain fell upon enthusiastic applause, and Madame Bourget, who had feared that her daughter would be a fiasco, was delighted with her success. Amid the hum of voices she heard the lady sitting next to her say to her neighbor, his sister, "I know, but for the part he is not sufficiently in love with her, and too much with his wife." "Did you notice," she continued, in a whisper. "In the second piece Henry appeared as Pierrot, Renée as the forsaken wife, and Noémie as the beloved. Henry played with real passion. From time to time his eyes seemed to search for Madame Bourget's. Her neighbor felt her leaning against her shoulder. The curtain fell. Madame Bourget swayed, and fell back in a faint. She was carried to the garden. "Leave me now," she said, "I am all right now, it was the heat. I only want a little air. Let Henry stay with me." They were left alone. "You love her," said Madame Bourget, clutching Henry's arm. "I know all. Have you nothing to say?" "Nothing. I have struggled for a year. I will not excuse myself. I owe you the truth. I love your daughter, it is true." Finally, Madame Bourget rose and walked towards the house. Henry followed. "I count upon never seeing you again, sir," she said, without looking round. With a mighty effort she regained her composure, and walked back to the house on Henry's arm. Stoned to death by his sister, it was Madame Bourget herself who insisted upon seeing Henry again, and, since he did not answer her letter, she went to his apartments. The interview was painful, but she gave her consent to Henry's marriage with Noemi, and undertook to overcome M. Bourget's possible objections, on condition that Henry should humor her husband's vanity by adopting a title, an easy matter enough. The Maupins had a farm called Villacourt. Maupin de Villacourt would do very well. Henry promised to see what he could do. Madame Bourget and her daughter called on the Maupins next day. The two girls were asked to leave their mothers to their talk, and to take a walk in the garden. "A secret," said Renée, as soon as they were alone. "Can you guess it?" "I can, my brother." "But you are crying." "What is it, my darling Noemi?" "Oh, you don't know," her friend sobbed. "I cannot. If you only knew. Save me. If I could only die." "Die? But why?" "Because your brother is—" She stopped in horror at what she was about to say, then whispered the rest of her sentence into her ear, and hid her face on her friend's bosom. "You lie." Renée pushed her back. "I." Renée did not reply, but looked sadly and gently into Noemi's eyes. Renée doubted no longer. She was silent for a moment. She felt almost the duties of a mother towards this child. In the evening Henry was surprised to find his sister waiting in his room. She approached the subject of his impending marriage, and implored him, by his love for her, not to give up his name, and to break off the match. "Are you mad? Enough of this." Renée fixed her eyes upon her brother. "Noemi has told me everything." Her cheeks flushed, Henry turned deathly pale. "My dear," he said, with a shaky voice, "you interfere in things which do not concern you." A young girl then seizing her hand, he pointed towards the door, and said, "Go." Renée was ill for a week, and Henry, knowing the cause, did his best to alleviate her suffering. Still, a coldness remained between them. He understood that she had forgiven the brother, but not the man. One day she accompanied Henry to town and went with him to the record office, where he had to make some inquiries about the legality of adopting his own name. While he was questioning the keeper, she overheard two clerks discuss her brother and his claim. "He thinks the Villacourt family is extinct. But he is misinformed, although they have gone down in the world. In fact, I know the heir to the title A.M. Boisjorand, with whom I once had a fight when we were boys. They lived in the forest of the Croix du Soldat, near Saint-Mihiel, at La Motte-Noire." Renée fixed these names in her mind. "I have got all I want," said Henry, gaily coming towards her. And they went out together. The Bourgets were giving a great ball to celebrate the public announcement of the engagement of their daughter to M. Maupin de Villacourt. "You are enjoying yourself," said Renee to Noemi. "I have never danced so much, it is true." And Noemi took her arm and drew her into a small salon. "No, never." She kissed her. "Oh, what it is to be happy. She loves him no longer. I am sure of it, I can see it, I feel it." "And you love him now?" Noemi closed her mouth by pressing her lips upon Renee's. A young man came to claim Noemi for the dance, and Denoisel requested the same favor from Renee. Denoisel was with Henry Mauprin. They were smoking and talking peacefully, when the door was thrust open, and a man forced his way in, pushing aside the valet who wanted to prevent him from entering. "M. Mauprin de Villecourt?" he asked. "That is my name," said Henry, rising. "Good. My name is Boisjoran de Villecourt," retorted the stranger, striking him so violently on the cheek that his face was immediately covered with blood. Henry conquered his first impulse to throw himself upon the intruder, and said calmly, "You find that there is one Villecourt too many, so do I. Leave your card with my servant. I shall send to you tomorrow." It was from a marked number of the Moniteur which the impoverished heir of the glorious name of de Villecourt found on his return from a 2-years' sojourn in Africa, that M. Boisjoran had learned that Henry had taken from him this name, which was all that had come down to him from his famous ancestors. He immediately proceeded to Paris and sought legal advice, but found that his poverty rendered legal action impossible. After his interview with the solicitor, he went straight to Henry's apartment to obtain the only satisfaction that was in his power. Denoisel and another friend of Henry's arranged with Boisjoran's seconds next morning the details of the meeting. Henry, who was an excellent shot, had insisted on pistols at 35 paces, each combatant to have the right to advance 10 steps. The duel was to take place at 4 o'clock the same afternoon near the ponds of Ville-d'Affray. Neither of the two adversaries showed a trace of nervousness. The signal was given, M. de Villecourt advanced 5 steps, Henry remaining stationary. At the 6th step Henry fired, and his opponent fell. Henry hurried towards him. "Back to your place," shouted the wounded man. On his hands and knees he crawled forward to the limit of his advance, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Then he took careful aim and Henry fell with arms extended and his face towards the ground. 4 broken wanderers. To Denoisel fell the painful duty of informing Mauprin of his son's death. The old man's grief was heartbreaking. When Denoisel was admitted to Renee, he found her sitting on a footstool, sobbing, with her handkerchief pressed to her mouth. "Renee," he said, taking her hands, "he has been killed. That man should never have known. He did not read, he saw nobody, he lived like a wolf, he was not a subscriber to the Moniteur. Some enemy must have sent him that paper." Renee had risen, she moved her lips, she wanted to scream, "It was I." Then, suddenly pressing her hand against her heart, she fell senseless on the floor. Renee did not seem to recover from her illness. Denoisel saw her daily, but a certain coldness had set in between them. He thought that Renée held him responsible for not having prevented the duel, while Renée vaguely feared that de Noisel had guessed her secret. He started upon a long journey. In those days of illness and anxiety, the hearts of father and daughter seemed to come together more closely even than before. The heartbroken old man saw his beloved child wasting away. He called in the best specialist from Paris, who did not exactly give up all hope, but did not conceal that Renée's life was in danger. The poor girl, who could not bear to witness her father's misery, put on a gay air, assuring him again and again that she was recovering. Indeed, when, at her urging, the family removed to the country house where she had spent her childhood, there was a real and marked improvement, and for a while the roses seemed to return to her pale cheeks. But she soon fell back into her listless state. Thus she lingered on for several months, always cheering her father and speaking of her happy future, always fading away until she became a mere shadow of her former bright and healthy self. Only to de Noisel, when after a long absence he returned from the Pyrenees, she opened her heart. To him she confessed that she knew her days were counted. Those who travel far afield have perhaps met in foreign towns or among the ruins of dead places, now in Russia, now in Egypt, two aged people, a man and a woman, who seem to march along without looking and without seeing. They are the Mauprin's father and mother. They have sold everything and have gone. Thus they wander from land to land, from hotel to hotel. They wander, trying to lose their grief in the fatigue of the road, dragging their weary life to all the corners of the globe. James Grant Bothwell, the author of Bothwell and many other romantic tales, was a Scotsman by birth, parentage, and perfervid sentiment. He was born at Edinburgh on the 1st of August, 1822. His father was a distinguished Highland officer. By his mother he was related to his illustrious literary exemplar, Sir Walter Scott. He was only 23 years of age when the romance of war made him one of the most famous authors of his day. Other tales quickly followed, including, in 1853, Bothwell, or The Days of Mary Queen of Scots, and it seemed as if readers could not have too much of the lively adventure and vigorous historical portraiture to which Grant unfailingly treated them. Altogether he wrote more than 50 novels, many of them involving considerable research. Grant outlived his popularity, the public sought new writers, and when he died, on the 5th of May, 1887, he was penniless. For fertility of incident, rapid change of scene, and skillful intermingling of historical with imaginary people and events, Bothwell is not surpassed by any of the romances that came from its author's fertile pen. Anna of Bergen, Erik Rosenkrantz, governor of Agerhuis, in Norway, and Castellan of Bergen, stood in the hall of his castle to welcome noble guests. It was a bleak and stormy day in September of 1565. Ill, indeed, would it have fared with the newcomers had not Conrad of the Saarburg, the young captain of the crossbowmen of Bergen, ventured forth on the raging sea at the peril of his life, and piloted their vessel into safety. The first of these was a tall and handsome man, about 30 years old, with a peculiar, daredevil expression in his deep, dark eye, richly attired, and wearing a long sword and Scottish dagger. His companion, who deferentially remained a few paces behind, was a man of gigantic stature, swarthy and dark in complexion, with fierce and restless eyes. Sir Eric, began the Chamberlain, allow me to introduce Sir James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a noble peer, ambassador from Mary Queen of Scots to His Danish Majesty. We thank you for your gracious hospitality, fair sir, said Bothwell, with a profound courtesy. Then, turning to Conrad, and now, brave youth, by whose valor we have been saved, let me thank you. He warmly shook Conrad's hand, while the youth tried to catch the eye of Anna, the governor's fair-haired and lovely niece. But Anna was too intently regarding the strangers. Suddenly Bothwell perceived her, his color heightened, his eyes sparkled. Anna, Lady Anna, he exclaimed, art thou here? When we parted at the palace of King Frederick, I feared it was to meet no more. Thou seest, my lord, she replied gaily, that fate never meant to separate us altogether. It was Bothwell who sat by Anna's side at the banquet, not Conrad, her lover from childhood. Conrad was displaced and slighted. He left the hall with a heart full of jealous and bitter thoughts. Dost thou not see the hand of fate in this meeting with Anna? Said Bothwell, when retiring, to his gigantic companion, Black Hob of Ormiston, the most merciless and ferocious of border barons. Nay, said Hob, I perceive only the finger of mischief. I own to thee, replied the Earl, that all my old passion is revived in full force. My whole heart and soul are hers, he went on passionately. Remember your solemn plight to the Lady Jane Gordon. If that be broken, our doleful case will be worse than ever. For Bothwell was no ambassador, but an exile, and his real mission to King Frederick was in pursuit of a design to hand over the northern Scottish Isles to Denmark, and become viceroy of them. Hob, be not insolent, retorted Bothwell. I love her 1,000 times more than Huntly's sickly sister. It was always thus with this reckless noble. The passion of the moment was ever too strong for past pledges and future policy. While waiting at Bergen for the ship to be repaired, he wooed Anna with all the skill of an accomplished man of pleasure. Anna's heart was ready to be won, and it was not long ere Bothwell, having gained her love, asked Governor Rosencrantz for her hand. To his mortification, he was refused. Anna, said the governor, had long been pledged to Conrad. But Conrad, meanwhile, was in despair. Anna no longer smiled upon him. He was lightly cast aside to make way for a more favored lover. One evening he was missing. A day and a night passed, and Conrad was nowhere to be seen. Search for him was useless, he had disappeared. 2 letters were brought to Bothwell by a king's messenger. One was from King Frederick, commanding him to desist from his mock embassy, and instantly leave the Danish seas. The other, from the Earl of Huntly, told him that his enemies in Scotland were banished, and his forfeiture reversed. Bothwell's thoughts instantly turned to Anna. He knew that she would not accompany him unless he married her, and policy now more than ever required that he should keep his troth to the sister of his friend, the Earl of Huntly. Then there occurred to him the sinister thought of a mock marriage. His actions were quick, and his persuasions, to the lovesick Anna, irresistible. That evening the two were wedded by a crazy hermit who dwelt among the rocks of the fjord, and Anna, without a word of farewell to her kin, left her native land, it might be forever. A stormy voyage brought the ship to Westray, in Shetland. Bothwell escorted Anna to the castle of Noltland, and as she landed at the pier, a young man sprang forward and helped her across the plank. She felt agitated, she knew not why. She looked at the man's face, but it was concealed. It was Conrad. He had fallen over a cliff, had been carried out to sea on a plank, had been picked up by a ship which had carried him to Shetland, and had taken service with the Castellan of Noltland. The unexpected sight of Anna brought back his emotions to their starting point, and recalled the poignancy of the hour in which he had realized that he had lost her. "To Bothwell Castle I have resolved," exclaimed the Earl, on the morning after their arrival at Noltland. "I would be worse than mad to forego the prospect of power by marring my union with the sister of Huntly." "Cock and pie! Now thou speakest like a man of metal," growled Hob. "Anna is not my first love," mused the Earl. "Have I not felt how feeble have been my sentiments for Anna, for Jane of Huntly, for all who have succeeded her whom I met in France long ago? Then thou wilt sail, yes, like Inez, leaving my Dido behind me." With a pretence of the love he felt no longer, Bothwell bade Anna farewell, and left her to doubts which, as the months went on and his promise to return was not fulfilled, gradually rose to despair. During the decline of a spring evening, as Anna wandered dejectedly on the battlements, Conrad stood before her for the first time since her arrival at Noltland. "Conrad," she faltered, "thou here?" "Anna, dear Anna," exclaimed the unhappy young man. "I have tidings to tell thee. The false Lord of Bothwell hath been espoused to the sister of Huntly." "And I," gasped Anna. "Thou art a captive for life in this island castle." Anna would have fallen backwards had Conrad not sprung to her assistance. "Listen," he said, in a low voice. "If thou wouldst escape, an hour will set thee free. Yes, land me once in Scotland, and I will make my way to Bothwell." That night Anna was on a Norwegian vessel bound for Glasgow, and Conrad was with her. She could not, he knew, be his bride, but he could at least protect and cherish her, and strive to redress the wrongs she had suffered. A storm was gathering above the lovely valley of the Clyde one June evening as two strangers, a man and a woman, plodded wearily towards Bothwell Castle. The woman became wholly exhausted. The man laid her gently down in shelter among the ruins of Blantyre Priory, and went on his errand alone. The storm had now burst, and the river was rising rapidly, but Conrad, for it was he, plunged into the raging waters, and strove to swim across. The current was too strong for him. he clung to an ash tree that projected over the stream, and was nearly exhausted when a man on the bank flung down his mantle and poniard, plunged in, and dragged him to the shore. Conrad, almost senseless, was carried within the castle. When he had revived and was dressed in dry garments, he was brought before his rescuer. It was Bothwell himself. "I thank thee," said Conrad proudly, "for saving my life." "Thou didst save mine." "We are now equal," replied the Earl. "'Tis well. I would not be thy debtor for all the silver in the mines of Burgern. Lord of Bothwell, I tell thee in thine own hall that thou art a dishonoured villain." "Thou art stark mad," cried the Earl. Then he went on, "Conrad, I have wronged thee deeply. In my youth I loved one who neglected me as cruelly as thou hast been neglected, and since then a mischievous spirit of vengeance, as it were, has led me to make women my playthings, to be won and thrown aside. I love thy spirit, Conrad." "If I could be thy friend never," cried Conrad. "I come not for friendship, but for justice to Anna. Hast thou not wedded another after thine espousal of her? Dost thou deem the mock blessing of yon mad hermit a spousal right?" exclaimed the Earl, laughing. Conrad repressed his passion. "I go to push my fortune with your turbulent border chiefs, and if, in the strife that will soon convulse this land, thou meetest Conrad of Saarburg, look well to thyself." "Go thy way, and God be with thee," replied the Earl. "Thou art the first who hath bent a dark brow on a lord of Bothwell under his own roof-tree." Conrad returned to Anna, and in the ruined priory told her how Bothwell was false to her. Anna's grief was dreadful to behold. "Anna," said Conrad, after a pause, "Scotland hath a queen whose goodness of heart is revered in every land save her own. True, and at her feet will I pour forth my sorrow and my tears together." So the two traversed the thickets around the priory, and reached the broad highway, which was to lead them at length to Edinburgh. "Three Mary Queen of Scots," but it was long ere Anna looked upon the face of the Queen. At the Red Lion Inn in Edinburgh her beauty struck the eye of the Earl of Morton, the factious, proud, and ferocious associate of Murray in all the dark intrigues of that craftiest of Scottish statesmen. Morton promised that Anna should be entrusted to a lady of fair repute, and soon presented to the Queen. Conrad trusted him, little knowing that the repute of Dame Alison Craig, Anna's new guardian, was anything but fair, and set forth for the border. It was to Sir John Eliot of Park that he offered the service of his sword, for it was against this turbulent borderer, who had just raided Northumberland, and threatened the peace of the two kingdoms, that Bothwell was advancing with the army of Queen Mary. Now garrisoning some solitary peel tower, now hiding in some unfathomed cavern, now issuing with uplifted lance from the hags of some deep moss, Conrad engaged with ardour in every desperate foray, and his daring made him the idol of the wild spirits around him. In every deed of arms one thought was in his mind to come within a lance length of Bothwell. Long and fierce was the struggle, but it ended as a fight so unequal was bound to end. John of Park was slain, refusing with his dying breath to surrender, and Conrad was carried, a half-senseless captive to Bothwell's castle of Hermitage. Even then the Earl spared his life. He lay in a hideous den, in pitch darkness and dead silence broken only by the splash of drops of fetid water that fell from the slimy arch of the vault. No token reached him of what was happening above, and an event happened there that had vast influence on Bothwell's future. Across the hills to Hermitage rode the Queen of Scots herself. The sight of her stirred in Bothwell's heart an emotion he had never wholly conquered, for she, Mary herself, was his first love of the bygone days in France. He had begun to realize that he loved her still. He knew the coldness of her relations with the dissolute and unfaithful Darnley, her husband. Now she had come to Hermitage. "Jesu Maria!" cried the Queen, as Bothwell, with beating heart, paused in the conversation. "Have you lost your tongue?" "Nay, madam, my heart." "That is very serious, but search for another." "I want no other," replied the Earl, in a trembling voice, "but thine." "Lord Bothwell," she said, with a hauteur that froze her admirer, "thou art in a dream." "Pardon me, I pray you." "I do pardon thee," replied the Queen, with a calm smile, but added, significantly, "I think 'tis time I was riding from Hermitage." So ended the famous visit to Hermitage, which was interpreted throughout Scotland as a token of Mary's love for her favourite Earl. Conrad, a month afterwards, was sent to Edinburgh and confined in the old Tower of Holyrood, awaiting trial as a border outlaw. Bothwell himself soon followed, and celebrated his return by a wild revel in company with Hob of Ormiston and other choice spirits. As the revellers wandered through the narrow streets at midnight, seeking a quarrel, they passed the house of Dame Alison Craig. "My page tells me," said Bothwell, "there is a famous foreign beauty concealed there." "Ho!" Within. "A stoup of water, poured on them from an upper window," was the answer. Broke open the door,